All right, looks like we are live. Welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie. Thank you all for being here for tonight's important discussion with Team Standing for Truth, fellow members, the superstars of the team, Professor David McQueen and George Bond. What are we discussing tonight? We are discussing the ordering of the fossils. Are they best explained by creation or evolution? And the last 30 minutes or so, we will be responding to more of our favorite critic, Gutsick Gibbon, and her misunderstandings of the fossil fuel industry. We will have some time as well, ladies and gentlemen, to take a few questions. So please make sure you're tagging me. Professor McQueen, I apologize. You're on mute, brother.
No,
thanks for being
no problem.
here.
This will be Erika 4 at the end. Hello, George. I understand I can visit you now in Australia. They've lifted the ban.
Yes, David. Yes, David. And that intro music just got me so hyped up. I ran up the stairs and got my undies and put them above my clothes.
Oh, you're so funny. Now let's go to the back cave now and get ready for tonight. But we don't have much time to fool around. Yep. It is 32 degrees. It is 0 degrees C in Louisiana. It's probably hot where you are, George, right?
27 C here. So it's very nice. Boy.
Yeah. It's -6 here.
Oh, man, man alive, I'm dying.
Not much fun here in Canada.
You know, let's get right into it because we want to be sure that we focus. Let me move my screen. Ms. McQueen has been displeased with my use of sheets of paper. And so she now has got me my first whiteboard. If I do well, she may get me a bigger one. So we're going to be talking about the order of the fossils. In the last 30 minutes, we'll go on to the business about oil. But George has done a tremendous amount of research. He's going to take the second 15 minutes. I'm going to acknowledge twos, that two. That was yesterday. That's an amazing day for those of us that are stamp collectors. It was 50 years ago, George. That's why I've got the heart there. It was 50 years ago in February that Ms. McQueen said yes. And so we're celebrating this year our 50th wedding anniversary. But now, that's so much for that order. Let's now begin the timer for my 15 minutes. And I want to give an introduction to this. George, do you have a preliminary joke or anything you want to tell before I go into my part?
No, this is too serious. I've done away with the joke today, so I'm just going to stick to the real.
This is a serious matter.
No, it's not the same without a joke from George Bond. It's just not the same.
Let's not lose our heads here. Tell me a joke.
There we go. We got the joke for the night.
No, George does have a turn. No, he can tell his own joke when he gets on. Okay, so how do we begin this discussion about the order of the fossil record? Well, let's begin it this way and get my graphic here going. I hope you can see that this is the chart showing the order of the fossils according to the evolutionary viewpoint. Down here, now this is from a 1976 issue of Fossils magazine. And so they don't have much about the Precambrian or the Ediacaran fossils and so forth, but it does start with the Cambrian here. Again, supposed to be 500, 600 million years old. And there we have our friend, the trilobite that we've talked about before, different kinds of trilobites evolving through time to ammonites. And then here we go, Cambrian, Ordovician. There's an Ordovician trilobite there. And then on up to the Silurian and Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian on this chart here. And so this is the evolutionary order that I am a critic of and have been for 40 years. So this is the evolutionary viewpoint that I am so critical of. When you go, as you see on my other board over there, I think you can see a group of gastropods, and then the rest of that there is the National Museum of Natural History there in D.C. I began leading tours in 1980 and was thrown out of the place in 2004, a story for another time. And so I've been interested in fossils. Now, what is my viewpoint? My viewpoint is that of a young Earth creationist geologist. I believe that the Earth is, and the universe, 6,000 years old. The foundational event for fossilization is the Great Flood that occurred in Noah's day. And so this is my foundation. This is my assumption of my model. Now, evolutionists throughout my life have said, well, McQueen, why is there any order at all to the fossil record? How come that you can go to a place like the Grand Canyon and you really can begin in the Cambrian rocks and find trilobites, and then you can go up to the, oh, wait, can you go up to the Ordovician in the Grand Canyon? Turns out you can't. It's missing. Isn't that interesting? Well, let's keep going. We'll go up and find the Silurian in the Grand Canyon. Oh, wait. Carry out some. There's no Silurian either. That's odd. Then you keep going to the Devonian period, which was named in England for Devonshire, in the same way that the Cambrian period was named for the Cambry tribe in Wales. And then in between them, you have this argument in the 1800s about, well, okay, we got Cambrian, Ordovician. What's Silurian in England? Well, that's just topic for another time. But then you go over and you find Mississippian, and you really do find coal measures in England and so forth. Where does the argument come? George and I are going to present to you tonight the idea that ecological zonation is fully adequate to explain what we do see in the fossil record. Now, what I pointed out a moment ago about the missing Ordovician, the missing Silurian in the Grand Canyon, therein lies a very important issue. Why are they not there? They are not there because these index fossils for the Silurian, for the Ordovician Silurian, are not found there. The challenge that I want to take up tonight is a challenge that Jackson Rowe has thrown out in the past and other evolutionists. They say, McQueen, when you go back to all the humans that were alive, you're claiming that there may have been 100 million humans alive at the time of the flood. How come as they were killed, she's lost her head here, as they were killed and floating around, complete with makeup on, which is quite odd. But at any rate, so she's floating around here. How come a bunch of these Jackson Rowe, see, I keep this to think of you. This is a shark's tooth, the size of her head. How come we don't find her head and a shark's tooth? Let me get my other toys. My grandchildren are going to be so troubled at this. How come this is, I think, that would be a bison, I think. How come we don't find that with it? Mixed in with dinosaur fossils. I'm beginning to run out of neck here. And then giraffes. How come we don't find all these jumbled together? Well, I think there's a very adequate explanation for that. And I actually called Dr. Gary Parker this week in Florida, and I asked him the question, and he gave a fascinating answer, which I will save for next time. Let's see. We are 12 minutes, so I got 3 minutes left before I turn it over to George. So what can I say in conclusion? The overall concept of ecological zonation is that you find trilobites low in the record because they could not escape the rising floodwaters. You don't find me here in Louisiana living near Boudreaux. This is Boudreaux, pet alligator that lost his way, and one of my friends, actually he's from South Louisiana, an Acadian and a French. He actually ate the thing, but I won't go into that. He saved me the head. So how come human fossils are not routinely found with alligators and crocodiles? Well, it turns out here in Louisiana, even though I've seen these in the waters, I don't choose to live near an alligator in the same way that I would imagine that the pre-flood people chose not to live where the dinosaurs were. And so the fact that Boudreaux and dinosaurs like this one could escape the rising floodwaters is one reason why they are found higher in the rock record than otherwise. George, is that a fair introduction to get you going?
I'll just add that recorded history shows lions once roamed the Middle East. We don't find any lion fossils with humans there either. So that's another point. But my presentation might take a little bit longer than that, David. But I'll try and stream it into 15 minutes. So Donnie, I need you to share my screen, please.
No, sounds good.
Now, of course, some of these items, George, we can take up in the Q&A part and as the hour and a half goes on. So we're just starting out with a 15-minute intro.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
All right. As I always start, or sometimes finish with it, may the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light, your ears to the truth, and your heart to His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Now, just to divert a little bit, we've all talked about, we're going to talk about extinctions and so on, but please note that extinction is more than just creatures. President Reagan once said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. That is, they don't inherit it through our DNA. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. So just keep that in mind in terms of what's going on in Canada and various other parts of the world. Okay, so I'm going to pose this question to some of the skeptics that are in the show at the moment. I'm going to ask them a question, but please note I've underlined empirical methodology. Okay, what is the empirical methodology that will establish an ancestral relation between mineralized fossils? We all know what empirical methodology means. Observable, repeatable, measurable, predictable. Okay, how on earth can you show an empirical methodology that establishes that ancestral relationship? Purely, I'll say this purely, it is based on presuppositions, okay, supported by vivid imagination and unproven and unverifiable assumptions, which leads them to speculation and conjecture. That's why I always say there is no fossil record, because you cannot prove that one fossil gave birth to something else. Okay, so a short introduction here. Again, this sort of proves what the Bible says about Earth once being united. Okay, and we can show that because we find similar fossils through many of the continents we have today. Okay, scrolling down, you can see trilobites there in various parts of the continents. In Brazil and Africa, again, similar fossils. I watched this just last night, actually. It's from the Creation Evidence Museum. And I think Professor McQueen touched on it a little bit with his geological layer. you'll find from the geological column, the secular geological column, we go through the Grand Canyon, the Chippewa Falls, right through to North Africa, the Middle East, and these are mega sequences. We have done studies on these layers, and we can verify that they're the same type of material. So these are what we call mega sequences. They actually span across multiple continents. Your limestone, for example, the Tepeet sandstone, all those sorts of things can be traced all the way across even through up to England, I believe. Now, as I've said there, secular geology can't explain the fact that we find the same layers and fossils contained right across the Earth without reference to a global flood. As a global flood can, so they obviously avoid it. These are what creationists call mega sequences. You can't get more mega than those layers stretching across multiple continents. Now, secular geology will only talk about sediment deposits in lake sediments, basins, oceans, where particles are in suspension and they gradually sink to the bottom, like the valves we keep have to answer. I'll show you later some observable science. This is operational science, how we have demonstrated basin deposits, synclines and anticline formations only took 20 minutes to form in a flume experiments. You don't need millions of years. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to play a couple of short videos just to introduce you into the topic of ecological zonation. This is, as I said, from the Creation Evidence Museum. So I'll let it go. I think I've clicked the audio button. So let me know, Donnie, if the audio is coming through.
The great fountains of the deep were opened up. And it says that it rained down upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. If you calculate that, which I did, there were about 960 minutes in that length of time. That means that the deposition rate was about 7 to 8 feet per hour. 7 or 8 feet per hour of water was being deposited on the surface of the earth to cover the highest mountains. At that time, probably the Pangeic Mountains were about maybe 7,000 feet high. We're talking about such a tremendous amount of force involved here, people, that is beyond man's imagination to understand exactly how much force that was. 62.4 pounds per cubic foot is what water weighs. And you're talking about all this force of the moon's gravity, plus the force of all and I think the moon was probably supplying most of the motion in that water moving around. You had turbidity flows from mountains under the ocean. You had all kinds of things going on, mud flows, lahars, and everything else, all going on at one time. That is a tremendous force. God completely altered the appearance of the earth from all of that. The original mountain ranges were marrowed down to little short mountains like the Appalachian Mountains and the Ozarks and the Ouachitas and everything else. Those are some of the original mountain ranges. So this thing actually scoured the earth and changed everything. But now we get back to this transgression, regression cycles about how this was deposited. Now, with the moon's gravity causing all this flow to come in and come out. If you get that back up, the moon is here and the earth is here. The earth rotates counterclockwise. Right here. If you look down on the north pole of the earth is rotating anti-clockwise. And the moon is going around the earth anti-clockwise too. So it takes 27 days for the moon to go completely around, and the earth rotates one complete rotation every 24 hours. All that combined together, people, the rotation of the earth causing.
Okay, you get the message there. So I'm just going to go to the last minute, and it explains where actually the term ecological zonation came from. Again, the secular people borrowed a creationist term.
Yes.
Here we go.
So as you come up the geologic column and you see all these different organisms that lived at different layers, those are called index fossils, by the way. Yes. Those all lived in the same place. They all were found in the same place they lived. All right. That's what I called ecological zonation. That's what I called it. Ecological zonation. They were buried where they lived. And the highest forms, the highest animals that could escape the flood the best were at the very top. And that's why you see them. That's why you see all the benthic organisms out at the bottom. Pretty simple when you really get right down to it.
Yes.
So that's the whole deal. Right?
All right. All right.
Yeah, very good.
I
Very
have
good.
read for decades and used the term. I read it, so used it, ecological zonation. Are you the one who came up with that?
We did it at ICR back in the old days.
You and
Gary Parker did that, actually.
you and Gary Parker.
Gary Parker, yeah.
Let's give him another hand. This is exciting. This is so exciting.
Okay, now I'm going to show you a second one. This one's doing some experiments in stratification, where it can actually demonstrate where the top fossil in the top layer can actually be younger than a fossil found lower down into the stratified layers.
As with particles of sediment, organisms get swept along laterally by strong currents and deposited successively in sediments in which they become fossils. When the sediments hardened into rock, the position of the fossils provided no indication of age. Fossil 1, in the upper strata, for instance, was deposited before fossil 2 in the lower strata. Fossil 1 could, therefore, be older than fossil 2 in the lower strata. The second major question was to what...
Okay, so as you saw there, there's a demonstration that shows that how layers actually form. They actually form sideways and vertically, right? And as you saw there, that fossil 1 was deposited first and fossil 2 was deposited second. So that just shows you that fossil 1, being on the higher layer, was actually older than fossil 2, which was deposited in the lower layer. This for the geologists in the room, they probably are aware of the Holstrom's diagram. This is a figure which shows water velocity versus size particles. And you can see under certain conditions, you get sedimentation and transport. And if it's in another range, you get erosion. Okay, so, oops. So this is a bit of a summary. In a global flood would produce a general but jumbled burial order. And that's what we find. Now, the fossil record, as it exists today, comprises 95% sea creatures, nearly 5% plant matter, and just 0.25% vertebrates. What would survive the longest, do you think? Of course, the vertebrates, because they can move around. They're in a high area. So that's what we actually find. So in summary, so what do the fossils say? Wow, we've been intermingled with all sorts of strange fellows and rapidly buried alive all over the earth. What happened to us? So what is let me just stop sharing now. So what is ecological zonation? Well, quite simply, it's different life forms in different strata that reflect the serial destruction, transport, and burial of ecological life zones during the flood. Now, please keep in mind, okay, that the fossil patterns produced by a global tectonic watery cataclysm, such as, obviously we're referring to the global flood, are not likely to be explained by any one mechanism. It is more likely that numerous factors working with independently of and or against each other are more likely to explain the situation. So this is how we explain ecological zonation.
George, I think that we're almost at the 30-minute mark here. It'd be good. Why don't we take a couple of questions from the audience, Donnie?
David, if I can just have 1 minute.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
The actual categories that we actually rely on to actually explain the ecological zonation are things like mobility, intelligence, sorting action of the water or hydrodynamic sorting, and differential escape. I mean, I can actually explain to you what they are, but I think that's brief enough of an introduction. But can I say the secular people have got a bigger problem because what we find in that geological column are what we call OOPARTs, out of place artifacts. These include fossils and other things like hammers, bells, all sorts of things. Even out of order fossils are shown. So they have more. I think they have more of a difficult situation explaining these anomalies than we do. We can easily say it was a catastrophic event. There could have been a situation where things may have been jumbled up at some point. So we're not saying it was all nice and even. As I think Mr. Fleming was saying there, with the Earth and the Moon rotating, causing those wave motions, there would have been a lot of disturbance in that area, and things may have been moved around a fair bit. And there's lots of examples which I can prove to you that it was a catastrophic event, and not as the secular people would claim, something that occurred, a deposition that occurred over millions and billions of years.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there, David. Thanks.
Good point, George. Donnie, why don't you give George a question, and then I'll take a question.
All right, we've got a few questions here. There's one specifically on the Lenski E. coli experiment. I'll answer that myself during the break, when we have a break. And then, a couple questions we can get in for brothers David and George. Here's the first one that comes in from Big Bad Mama. I appreciate the question. She asks, at SFT, question for George. And but David, if you want to give your input, of course, too.
George, go first.
All right, George, here we go. Big Bad Mama's coming at you. So she asks, how did a terrestrial ecology come to be transported on top of a marine ecology, such that fine details such as footprints, burrows, and paleosols were undisturbed?
Well, if you understand what Mr. Fleming was talking about with the wave, the movements of the moon, or the orbit of the moon, and how it affected the tides, there would have been situations where the water, just like we have today, by the way, high tides and low tides, you would have had a situation where you had a low tide. Obviously, creatures trying to escape the flood would have walked on that. They would have had probably 12 hours or so for the imprint to set, when the next layer of deposition came and covered them up. So that's how I would explain that. David, you might have something more to add.
Yeah, and this bears on a very fascinating argument. You'll notice in George's presentation that one of the foundational rules go back to the 1800s of geology. George pointed out it might not be true, and that is that if you find layers one after another, the geologic assumption for over 200 years has been the lowermost layer is the oldest one, and then as you go up, they become younger and younger. This is the law of stratigraphy. Well, when you think about that in terms of what we've been talking about, our associate in Australia, John Mackay, has been doing some research that George is going to talk about later on that bears on this issue about how quickly things can be formed. Here is a photograph from the Glen Rose, Texas area. Going diagonally are dinosaur footprints, and going vertically are human footprints in a limestone called the Glen Rose limestone. There is, as many of our critics point out, a large debate about this particular locality, but let's assume for at least 2 minutes that this photograph of dinosaur and human footprints being in the same layer is true. How in the world could that be explained in a worldwide flood? the issue at stake here, and that bears on the question previously, is how can you get a group of fossils like a giraffe or a dinosaur like this? This is obviously a terrestrial group of creatures. How could you get that on top of a marine deposit that included shark's teeth? See if I can hold this better. That includes shark's teeth and plesiopods and gastropods and so forth. Well, George hit on it a moment ago in the intelligence of both man and also these creatures. But how do you explain a area like Glen Rose, Texas, where you find these dinosaur and human footprints in the same area? Let me get my eraser here. So his comments about intelligence and artifacts being found, I will tell in the second hour an event about a actual human fossil found in coal in West Virginia, which was sadly burned up in a gas station fire. But I'll come to that in a minute. Let's go first to this Glen Rose business. And I'm going to draw the state of Texas here as a triangle. It's not a perfect triangle, but that'll give you some idea of the shape of the state of Texas. And so over here, using a different color, we'll have Texas being that in that area, maybe 4 months into the flood. And then above it is a floating mat of vegetation. Now, let's be sure we get the scale right here. Texas is a huge state. When Mrs. McQueen and I in the past have driven east and west from where we lived all the way to El Paso, Texas, there's a panhandle in Texas that goes up like this. It takes us 2 days. So we're talking about not hundreds of miles, but thousands of miles across. And so notice how I've drawn this blue floating mat here of vegetation. The idea that I have been studying for 40 years is that this floating mat of vegetation the size of the state of Arkansas beaches at a certain point in Texas as Texas is being uplifted. And I will use brown here to illustrate an area in the middle where there may have been 100 humans huddled up on top of the floating mat. Now, remember, this is enormous. This is no toy in the bathtub here. This is an enormous floating mat, 100 people alive there. The biblical requirement is that everybody except 8 have to be dead after 12 months. I'm talking about 4 months into it here. And so this thing beaches in Texas near what is now called Fort Worth, the Glen Rose Formation. And so here in this area where I'm putting the huge X, a bunch of dinosaurs got off. Ms. McQueen has reminded me that Texas is 660 miles wide, to give you a sense of scale there. But where the X is, the dinosaurs get off first, make the footprints. They begin to solidify in the micrite mud that we've talked about before. And then the humans scamper off to be killed. And then they leave the human footprints there. Very controversial issue, but it does have some explanation within flood geology. The evolutionary community, George, what's their explanation for 100 million year discrepancy between dinosaurs and humans?
Yeah,
What do you
David,
think,
I've got something else to throw back. For those people that know where your lawn is, it's an area in Victoria, Australia. They have found a 0.5 metre, that's approximately a 20-inch thick layer of where 50% of it is actual pollen. So the only way such a layer of pollen could be obtained is through the sorting action of the water in a massive water catastrophe that probably gathered the plant material from a large area and deposited it in that location. Now, there's also some other evidence. I think you probably heard as well, David, the Mount Roraima pollen in South America. Now, it's found in 1.8 billion year old rock strata, okay, with hundreds of feet of overburden, which is long. Yes. This is it, which is long before multicellular organisms evolved, supposedly 380 million years ago. Now, I've read the paper, and their rescue device there was, get a load of this, their rescue device is the pollen got there through unnoticed micro cracks. Isn't that convenient? Unnoticed micro cracks. Oh, yes. That's so laughable.
Yeah, let me throw in a bit here too. If you think that the creationist critique of transitional organisms, when you're talking about going from invertebrates to vertebrates, is bad, explain to me paleobotany. Explain how you get from Bean to McQueen. Because obviously, if evolution is true, there should have been a time that I was part vegetable, and then, Dwayne Gish, all of his life made fun of this cow falling into the water and then crawling back out, and then he goes back in and becomes a whale. Well, what about the Bean to McQueen idea? I mean, how are you going to get angiosperms, gymnosperms evolving into each other? Ms. McQueen thinks that I would become a human being then. Well, that's troubling.
David, you don't understand evolution. You need to read a science book.
Yeah, how true. It's rough to deal with reality instead of fiction. But the point that we're making here is that the evolution of flowering plants, if you think we have problems, if you think the evolutionary community has problems in explaining the transitions to all these, let's go to the flowering plants. Now, let me very quickly go to this comment that Dr. Gary Parker made to me when I called him. I called him a few days ago in preparation for tonight, and I said, well, how would you then explain, Gary Parker, the apparent sequencing that you see in the fossil record? He said it's absolutely, completely understandable from the viewpoint of ecological zonation. And of course, you would expect a creature like a gastropod or a plesiopod, like you see over in this area. These are, see if I can get my finger moving the right way. The chart behind this chart over here, there we go, finally, is a group of gastropods. How come you find those beneath an elephant like you see below? Well, it has to do with ecological zonation and the building up of a sequence. Now, I have taught you before this vocabulary of Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and so forth, that I was taught as a geology student. Is there any place on Earth that you can find it? Well, the creation scientist, John Woodmorphy or Jan Peskus, claims that there is in the Morocco mountains of northwest Africa, one series of valleys that you really can walk through and go from Cambrian all the way up through Tertiary and Quaternary. Now, I've never been there. Best geologist is one that's seen the most rocks. I don't know the truth of this, but I know that the viewpoint that the high school students that I interact with have is that you go to the Grand Canyon and you're going to see a complete sequence. Nobody ever points out that the Ordovician, Silurian is missing. And then by the time you get up to the Coconino Sandstone, how come there's not a dinosaur there? Well, you have to go further up the column, further up north of the Grand Canyon to find dinosaur fossils in formations like the Morrison. So Gary Parker's point was very well taken, I think. And listen to this, and I'll stop after this. Parker says, you think about what that one world continent might have been like in the pre-flood world. And I said, well, a lot of the 21st century young people say, well, McQueen, 10% of all the world's population, 50% of all the world's population lives within a 1 hour drive of the beach. Well, that may be true in the 20th century, in the 21st century. But if you go back to, say, 1000 AD, most people were rural. They didn't live on the coastline. Why? Because you can't raise your crops and have your cattle graze on sandy beaches like in Eastern Australia or in the Caribbean. And so Parker points out that as the floodwaters began to rise, all of these farmers that were not at sea level, but rather maybe 1,000 feet above sea level, the farmers said, hey, let's get our cattle, let's get out of here. And so the humans and the cattle, dinosaurs and everybody, they start going to higher ground. And the people that did not believe Noah enough to get on board the ark, in other words, they weren't part of the 8 people, but they did sense, well, what if he's right? Some of these people had boats already that they used around the coastal area, the one world continent. So they got in their boats and floated above. And so the reason we don't find them intermixed, Jackson, with your favorite shark's teeth, is that they were floating above it. What do you think of that, George?
Well, I was reading some of the comments there. I just got one thing to say to Cool Jesus. Just stay where you are, Cool Jesus. I'll show you some recent research from Dr. Snelling and John Mackay from Creation Research on geological formations. Okay, so Donnie, I'd like to share the screen for a second just to add further evidence and information on what Professor McQueen was saying with regards to these orders of the geologic column, because it's just I can't understand how they can say things corroborate each other. I mean, you find these sort of anomalies all over the place, yet they just hand wave them away. They invent some kind of a rescue device, and people are gullible enough to actually swallow it. But this is my favorite in terms of how you refute this geological layering baloney. It's called the footprint fiasco, right? Now this is a creation.com article, but I'll show you later. It is based on secular papers. Okay, they're the footprints, and that laugh there is because you'll see why I've put it in. In 2005, when British scientists reported that they dated footprints at 40,000 years old, a direct challenge to the traditionally accepted view that humans only arrived in the Americas around 11,000 years ago. Now, here we go. Subsequent paleomagnetic analysis and radioactive dating of the volcanic ash, now by American geologists, put the date at 1.3 million years old. So in a nutshell, the dispute rides on the dating. Which date is correct, the British date or the American date? And now, if you say that the British didn't do it right or whatever, well, no. Well, the British actually employed a number of different dating methods, as you can read there. So the conclusion is the head of the Berkeley Geochronology Center in California, his name is Rennie, clearly does not trust the dating done by British team, and nor does the British team trust the Berkeley work. So that's why I laugh. And by the way, these are the references that refer to that article. So if you've got time to chase that up, just go to the CMI site and search for footprint fiasco and read all about it. And it's quite laughable because, as I'll say, we keep hearing this from people like Gutsick Gibbon, that dating methods corroborate themselves. What a joke! That's a total joke. There's scientists that have done numerous radiometric dates that have got different dates, and they can't agree upon those dates themselves. So yeah, what a joke.
Great
I'm
stuff
making
there.
a coffee. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I got a comment about that, but fill in for me, Donnie, please.
Okay, let me answer real quick a question here from Jackson Rowe. Jackson Rowe after show. So him and I kind of had an impromptu debate / discussion last night where we touched on ecological zonation as well. And he asks this question. He says, why are pterosaurs not found at the top? They could outfly the flood like birds. Okay, so my response to this really quickly is, for one, he seems to at least recognize that pterosaurs would live in different ecosystems than various bird species or variations. Okay, but here's the thing: pterosaurs and birds, any flyer for that matter, can't simply fly forever without landing and resting and refueling. Okay, take an airplane for example. It can only fly for so long before it needs to land and refuel. Okay, birds and pterosaurs can only fly for so long during a global worldwide flood until they need to land somewhere and take a break, refuel, I guess you could say. They would land in different areas and oftentimes get buried immediately, buried in different spots. Okay, they started in their own specific ecosystems, started flying, and therefore where they would land is not in the same spots. Okay. And pterosaurs actually may even fly back to their original habitat to land and then be quickly buried. That's why we don't really find them together. Different ecosystems and different locations buried ultimately. Go ahead. I just wanted to address that.
Donnie, I'm sorry. For once, I have to agree with Jackson here and disagree with you. Ms. McQueen and I were the other night. We heard some noise in our master bath. And when I got in there was a pterosaur that was flying away. And so Ms. McQueen asked me, well, why didn't you hear it earlier? And I said, well, the P is silent.
I was waiting for that one.
I like that.
Hey, Donnie, can I just add, there was a very interesting comment made by Dr. James Carter, I think a couple of days ago, or maybe even last week. This was his comments. He says, there are unsaturated fatty acids from specimens all throughout the geologic column. Those reactive double bonds would not last. Also, they aren't more degraded as you go down the column. So if the lower you go down the column, they get older, why do we find the same reactive bonds in those fatty acids that he was talking about? That's
very good.
Yeah,
good point.
The soft tissue part is just a nightmare for these old earthers. They cannot explain it. They believe that iron somehow magically preserved it. Again, I'll say, what a joke! If you believe that, you're more gullible than we think.
Well, let me throw in another comment from Dr. Gary Parker. We're 10 minutes away from my traditional 1-hour break here. So let me recommend this book to you. It's called Building Blocks in Earth Science by Dr. Gary Parker. In 2 months, we hope to have him on. George and I are going to interview him. But for now, we'll have to go with this picture of him on the back here with this big old thing. But in this book that came out in 2015, listen to the way he talks about the whole issue of the geologic column. And he uses the vocabulary geologic column diagram, GCD, which he calls fossils, faith, and facts. And he makes this very interesting observations here about the traditional geologic column that you see here that I have depicted on this. This goes all the way up to man here at the top. He says this: do sequences of fossil-bearing layers support a belief in millions of years? So let's switch off of traditional evolution. Let's talk about time here, like George was talking about. Is it millions of years of evolutionary progress based on Darwinian struggle and death? Or is it an example of a fallen, sin-cursed creation that got left off of Noah's Ark? The first major scientific study relating fossils to rock layers, was intensely practical, not philosophical. An English canal builder, William Smith, this is an engineer who's been elevated to the realm of being a geologist. George, I'm going to mail to you in a couple of months your junior geologist certificate so you can be a geologist too. But here's this engineer that was raised to the level of being a geologist, called Smith now. He was looking for a way to find and map underground rock layers, strata, that would hold water rather than letting it seep away quickly. So he had an engineering interest in it. And he found that suitable rock strata could be identified by the fossils they contain. And that's where he got the name Smith. In their search for oil, companies today still use Smith's technique, looking for fossils and drill cores to map promising underground rock layers. The last 30 minutes, I'll return to that. Smith's goal was practical, but other gentlemen intellectuals got into it. And this has to do with Sedgwick and so forth. So there are layers, there are these stratigraphic layers, but as Gary Parker points out, from the Cambrian explosion on, what you're seeing is an example of ecological zonation, just as George has mentioned there. We're 5 minutes away from my ordinary 1 hour break. And so with your all's permission, let me bring up another subject that is extremely important when we deal with this issue. We have been challenged by Jackson and others to say, okay, if there were 100 million people alive and they had pots and pans and hammers and all kinds of things, how come you don't find these somewhere in the rock record as out of place artifacts? Well, let me use one as an example that I have that I'm aware of. In the mid 1980s, I was a professor at the Institute for Creation Research, and I taught at Christian Heritage College in San Diego. It's now called Shadow Mountain University or something like that. But in my day, a colleague of mine who's now passed away, Dick Neeson, was the fellow that taught Apologetics 101. And in the early 80s, let's call it 1980, I don't know the exact date, one of his students came up to him and said, you should come home with me for Christmas in West Virginia, because there is a human fossil encased in a block of coal that's about 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter cubic. And all the old men go down and drink coffee, and you can see the vertebrae in the hand and everything in this block of coal. Now, this is a coal mining community. These men certainly knew the difference between some sort of plant fossil or some sort of fern in contrast to a human fossil. Well, my colleague, Dick Neeson, got tremendously excited. He went to Dr. Henry Morris, he went to others, arranged a ticket, to go in a week or two to this gas station in West Virginia. And a few days before, to show you the satanic influence, the fact that information like this is guarded in the fallen world we live in. A few days before he was to fly out, the gas station burnt down. The coal burned up. The old men had to go someplace else to drink coffee. And that remarkable piece of evidence went away. What if someone had photographed it? What if it was something more than a conversation a conversation piece? These people that were drinking coffee and talking, they were intelligent men, but they weren't educated. They didn't understand the significance of finding a human fossil all the way down in the Carboniferous, Mississippi and Pennsylvania and so forth. That's a sad story, isn't it, Donnie?
Yeah. David, I read a comment there about soft tissues. Why don't we find more soft tissues? Well, for the same reason they didn't find C14 in the beginning. They weren't looking for it.
Exactly.
I mean, the pretty much every fossil now, the norm is they find C14, not the exception, but the norm is they find C14. And I dare say that if they were to crack some of those bones, if they're not fully permineralized, they would probably find some form of soft tissue within the bone, whether it be an osteocyte or whatever. And I think Mark Armitage mentioned the other day, Donnie, that they found...
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, nerves, for crying out loud, nerves.
Yeah. And
these biomaterials found in specimens dating back to the Permian, 300 million years. And
I was listening to Michael Ord's presentation, Donnie, the other day, and he made a very important point. He said, if you look at mammoth bones, they're real bones. But if you go back and look at dinosaur fossils and their bones, they've been lithified and replaced. And so that's an important point. We're at the 1 hour break now. May I turn it over to you two and you drop my video? I'll take a break and come back in 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor McQueen. That was a fantastic first hour. And as always, time flies by. So, Professor McQueen, enjoy your break. And George, it's just you and I for now. Brother, any comments you wanted to make real quick?
This is why I don't debate. I get very emotional and sometimes I lose it. So I apologize if I came out a bit strong there. But I get passionate, and that's why I won't entertain debating anyone. Hello.
Hey, George, I thought you'd get the hint. I had to run upstairs real quick and shut off the timer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oven, so. No worries. One thing I did want to...
I can keep talking if you like, and you can run up.
No, I just ran up, so I'm
okay, right,
good to go. My wife's with the baby, and so I'm here to help any way I can. So one thing I wanted to mention, too, and we talk about this frequently, okay, when it comes to our flood model, flood geology in general, George. And I recommend people check out my impromptu discussion with Jackson Rowe last night, where we discussed it in great detail. And George, the critics and the skeptics, they've failed to address this confirmed prediction. They've failed at every chance that they get, especially with the heat problem. But when it comes to catastrophic plate tectonics, we oftentimes talk about how seismic tomography has verified this model, right? And when they look at these subducted plates today that we oftentimes refer to, we find slabs that go all the way down, some to the top of the core, hundreds of miles down into the earth, right, George? And they're still cold. they are still cold. If they were moving just a few centimeters a year for millions of years, they should not be cold. They should have assimilated or have been cooked. All right, that means these slabs were obviously taken down there through runaway subduction just thousands of years ago. Now, why am I saying this? It's because a lot of evolutionists or skeptics or critics, they'll say that, flood geology, and especially as it relates to tonight's topic, the ordering of the fossils, is post hoc. Or we're just starting from the Bible. Here's the thing. We're starting from the Bible and we are making testable predictions. And guess what? These testable predictions have been confirmed. And these skeptics have no real explanation. And I want to just go over a few slides, if you don't mind, George.
Yeah.
Before Professor McQueen comes back. As I find the specific slides. Anything you wanted to comment on that, brother?
Well, there's also those two massive blobs under the Pacific and South Africa that are found to be hotter than the surrounding mantle material. Surely you'd expect in 4.5 billion years those hot blobs to have assimilated or at least equilibrialized with the surrounding temperature of the rest of the material in the mantle. And in addition to that, Donnie, we talk about super heavy elements. Why is it the super heavy elements like uranium and thorium, etc., haven't sunk down into the inner core, whereas iron and nickel have? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
No, there's so many observations that don't make sense from the uniformitarianism or actualism position. Okay. And when it comes to flood geology, especially at the initiation of the flood, these meters per second movements of the plates, this is what best explains the geological features of the earth, including the ordering of the fossils and ecological zonation, okay? Because present processes can't explain what we see. Present processes today can't explain the geological features of the earth. And as we just referred to, we've got confirmed testable predictions. But I wanted to go over a couple slides here real quick on this topic specifically before Professor McQueen gets back, in that we have explosions of life, okay? Which again is evidence for special creation and ecological zonation, okay? So for example, here, the Cambrian explosion. It's an excellent example of an explosion of life forms that the evolutionists have yet to respond with anything sophisticated. Below the Cambrian explosion, layers that contain, so we got layers before the Cambrian, right? The Cambrian explosion with little to no fossils in them. And then all of a sudden this explosion of all body plans and phylum and so on and so forth, right? Of the fossils that are found in these layers, most of them are single-celled algae and microbes. And a few are very unlike any organisms we are familiar with today. The Cambrian explosion represents the sudden appearance of almost every major group or phyla of animal. But notice this. We also see explosions of life in the post-flood fossil record. These are likely the result of the mega succession recovery, as discussed above, happening on a global scale. The Paleogene mammal explosion is one such example of this. We also see explosions when it comes to dinosauria groups, right? After the flood, every kind of air-breathing land mammal dispersed from the ark and throughout the world as they repopulated the planet. Many of them died in local or regional natural disasters, which subsequently buried them above layers containing fossils of animals that died during the flood. Okay, here's another thing I wanted to mention because I spend a lot of time dealing with human evolution. And you'll find a lot of these ape-like creatures like the Australopithecines and the many Australopithecus-like variations. You'll see them deeper than, let's say, humans, okay? But this fits perfectly with our model because after the flood, animals, what do? They migrate around the planet, around the globe. What do humans do? They don't do that. They localize themselves in one place. They go against the command of God, right, to spread out in all parts of the globe, essentially. And eventually, God confuses their languages, and then they migrate across the planet. We got subgroups of people migrating to different. Yeah.
Donnie, you also should mention the barcoding of was it the mitochondria that showed 90% of life actually arose roughly the same time as well.
Exactly. So we have evidence for, we have low genetic diversity in human beings, which is exactly what we'd expect. God creates two people. That limits genetic diversity right off the bat. And we also see, based on levels of diversity in that highly conserved mitochondrial gene, the CO1 gene, low levels of diversity, where that paper concluded, the Rockefeller study, that over 90% of species today originated at the same time. But here's what I wanted to say is, by the time humans migrate, okay, the animals have already migrated. Your Australopithecines, your other ape-like creatures have already migrated. Okay, so they get buried first in these local catastrophes, and then humans afterwards. So it's not that the Australopithecines, let's say specifically, are older. It's that they spread out first. Humans spread out later. So that's an important point. But this is a huge point right here, okay, when it comes to ecological zonation. This is very important, guys, okay, is the different elevations in the pre-flood world. See, a lot of these skeptics, they'll look at the ecosystems today, including ecosystems in the ocean, right? Whales and sharks, let's say, for example. They'll assume that the ecosystems of today is how it was in the pre-flood world. No, that's again, uniformitarian based assumptions. Okay, the entire real estate after the flood has been rearranged. Now, in Genesis chapter 2, the river coming out of the Garden of Eden is described as dividing into 4 rivers. What does this imply? Well, it implies that the Garden of Eden, with its fruit trees and other angiosperms, mammals and man, was at a high point geographically, right? Because rivers flow downhill. Isn't that right, George? Okay.
Correct.
So the river's flowing downhill to the lowland swampy plains bordering the shorelines where the gymnosperms grew and the dinosaurs lived. This would explain why we don't find human and dinosaur fossil remains together in the geologic record. Dinosaurs and gymnosperms only fossilized together, and angiosperms only fossilized with mammals, and man higher in the record, separate from the dinosaurs and gymnosperms. Another thing I want to mention is when it comes to humans, finding humans in the fossil record, especially pre-flood rocks, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, okay? And I'll tell you why. It's because the Bible says God created 2 people, Adam and Eve. He didn't just create 2 of every kind of animal. No, then he created populations of animals in fully working, perfect ecosystems. Billions of animals around the globe. So what would we expect? Buried as evidence for the flood. Billions of animals and very few to almost no human fossils, right? And who knows how many humans existed by the time of the flood. I mean, it could have been a lot or it could have been few, because we know the earth was full of violence. There was probably a lot of, murder and death and things like that. So yeah, I definitely wanted to point out the fact that we'd be looking at different elevations. Yeah, George, any thoughts, brother?
Yeah, you got one thing wrong there, Donnie. Apparently, water does flow uphill. That's how the Colorado carved the Grand Canyon.
That's true.
And by the way, in having done a bit of hydrology in engineering, there is a certain instance where we call it a hydraulic jump, where the actual velocity of the water is actually going backwards. So water can go backwards in some instances, but not uphill though. And I find it funny that, with the Grand Canyon, I laugh because when you do the maths, it just doesn't work. But
right.
They believe it, and people are gullible enough to swallow it. So fair enough.
Amen. Well, here's the last thing I want to say, and then I'm screen shared, so I can't see if Professor McQueen, Mr. Batman himself, is back, but I assume he is. So I just want to go over this quick slide now, guys, to sum everything up. And I think this is a good explanation, especially for the lay person. Okay, so our perspective is that although there still remain many mysteries in the fossil record, there are some big items that support a massive worldwide deluge in the past. Notice this. The sudden appearance, as we were talking about with the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of complex marine life in the lowest levels of fossil-bearing rocks. And remember, we have marine fossils in all layers. We have marine fossils buried with dinosaurs. marine fossils, in apparently the Cambrian explosion all throughout. The majority of fossils are marine. The progressive movement from sea to land animals, which is exactly what we would expect, the burials of different communities. Okay. The presence of billions of marine fossils throughout all the layers that are thought to be laid down by the flood. The presence of massive fossil graveyards, often containing millions of the same types of creatures buried together. How many animals died today? How many were fossilized? Probably none. Yet we find these massive, massive fossil graveyards, often containing millions of the same types of creatures buried together. The rapid burial in unique circumstances required for fossilization of enormous numbers of creatures. And lastly, the sudden appearance of modern mammal fossils near the top of the rock record. All exactly what we would expect given the Genesis flood. And Brother McQueen, good to have you. I hope you had a good break. And
it's so cold here. I had to get a new hat on, a new scarf. It's certainly 0 degrees C here in Louisiana. Little bit of humor there to begin, but let me get this.
We want you to be warm and comfortable for.
That's how true. I just wanted to point out some things.
David, did you have a silent P?
Yes, how true. That's how very true. But as an old man, we won't talk about that. Let's go back to the concept of zones, which are so important. And in this chart that I have here from a book I bought dealing with the National Museum of Natural History there in Washington, D.C. These are gastropods, I assume, from those swirls that you see. And notice that they are on display there, along with the famous elephant in the rotunda of the Smithsonian. I began leading tours there in 1980, ended in 2004. When you see this level of diversity and the beauty that you see, notice the question mark I have on this chart. What do we make of that? What do we make of those zones? Well, we need to hammer home and reiterate the point that that Donnie, you and George both have made so clearly, that as the floodwaters were rising, mammals, dinosaurs, humans could escape the longest, and the humans even longer than that, in the sense that they could intelligently go to the highest point. But we need, and George does a better job than this on this than I sometimes do. Let me go back to the truth of God's word, which we on Standing for Truth view as a reliable historical record. And let's go to the discussion of the beginning of the flood, which is in Genesis chapter 6. And I'm going to read from the King James here, Genesis chapter 6. And notice what he says here. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that in those days the Lord said, my spirit, in verse 3, will not always strive with men, for he is also flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. That's basically the amount of time that Noah had to preach to his world. And then in verse 5, we have the very sobering verse. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. I have to spend time online, obviously, to prepare for Standing for Truth. And if you spend any time doing what I suppose the teenagers call surfing the web, you are only a few clicks away from sadness, sin, wickedness of every kind. Donnie's point a few minutes ago was very well taken. If the conservative figure that I use of 100 million people were alive, they might have been alive when Noah started preaching that 120 years. They may have been alive at the beginning, but there's an escalation to violence. There's an escalation to sin. And so those bodies may have already been washed out to sea. Who knows? Maybe of the 100 million, 10 million were killed. It's a topic for another time, George, for us to study the issue that's called taphonomy, or what actually happens to a human when they are killed and are floating in the water. There's a restriction near the throat that traps air down in the lungs that have long since been eaten away of this dear lady. And so she tends to float in the column. We're asked every once in a while, well, what did the sharks and so forth eat during the time of the flood? And sadly, some of it may have been human. We have about 10 minutes left before we're going to go over to Erika's point. George, could you fill that 10 minutes with your response to some of this before we leave the topic of ecological zonation?
Yeah, I just add regarding the creatures when they die. I mean, we know that I think coagulation occurs roughly 20 minutes after death. So you have to ask yourself, how did the iron preserve tissues and collagen and all those sorts of things when their operational science experiment had a centrifuge? They used anticoagulants. So their whole experiment was not based on real environmental conditions. That's what I'm saying.
By the way, what George just brought up is a critical point as we think of you guys as our class. You need to really look into this rescue device that all you have to do is throw some iron in with Dr. Schweitzer's dinosaurs from the early days of this research of soft tissue all the way up to modern times. You can't just throw Fe+2 or Fe+3, whatever the chemistry of the iron you want it to be. You can't just put it in there and expect that, George, to rescue this whole argument, right?
Yeah, as Dr. Carter mentioned earlier, and I quoted him, certain fatty acids would break down quickly. And what they find is they find the fatty acids fairly similar from layer to layer, and you'd expect that not to be the case, because if each layer is older than the other, then you wouldn't expect to find the same amount of fatty acids in all those finds. I don't know. I think, David, it doesn't matter what we say. I'm pretty sure if a person is convinced that the Earth isn't young, they're not going to be. Their mind's not going to be convinced that and change.
And
so
your point, George, is well made. But I think that as we go from now through the next, it's almost March. So we've got maybe 9 months left between now and Christmas. I think as we month after month bring these issues up of very real problems with radiometric dating, very real problems with an evolutionary viewpoint, the excellent work that Donnie and his biological colleagues have done to show the absolute futility of trying to explain the X chromosome, the Y chromosome, the genetic structure based on an evolutionary picture. I think as we hammer away at this stone edifice of evolution, that who knows, of the hundreds of people that watch each presentation day after day, week after week, who knows the change in thinking in Jackson Rowe and Erika and the rest. I'm an optimistic. Maybe Jackson is optimistic that I'll see that there's some enormous problem with shark's teeth that I've overlooked. So I'm continuing to study, and I hope others are too.
Professor McQueen, I have a very good feeling that you'll never be convinced that banana plants and whales are related through common ancestry. I mean, that.
Well, I was hoping we would keep that a secret, but you're quite right. I'm very, very pleased to believe that mankind was created by God for a purpose.
Amen. Amen. So are we moving into the next phase, gentlemen?
Yeah.
Or is there...
Yeah. Let's do that. And what I, for my part, I want George to go first, but for my part,
I'd like to too.
Yeah, I want George to go first, but when it gets to my part, Donnie, what I'd like you to do is take that last geological critique that we're all aware of, that Erika seems to have a team of these geologists that feed her information. Go ahead and read a bit of that. And then after I answer that, I want to share with the group the conversations I have had with retired petroleum geologists and others about this whole basin modeling thing. George, let me kick the stone all the way to Australia, and you take over, my friend.
Okay. All right, Donnie, I'm gonna share. I hope Cool Jesus is still in the chat, because I'll show him some latest research done by creationists. So I'm going to share the screen.
I do want to point out too that in the description box is Debunking Gutsick Gibbon on the fossil fuel industry, part 1 and 2. Lots of great feedback. As everybody can probably see and will continue to see tonight, there hasn't been any real sophisticated rebuttal to Professor McQueen's response. So please check those out. And as everybody knows, we put out an evolution debate challenge at the end of 2021 for any of us on Team Standing for Truth. And we've got over a dozen debates, several with Professor McQueen as well, myself and others, over the next couple months. But one thing that I find funny and interesting is the so-called geologist go-to experts that Erika likes to go to. They've all dodged and they've run from a sophisticated debate. So I find that interesting. Anyways, yeah, go ahead, George.
Can you see my screen, Donnie?
No, actually, nothing's popping up. Let me try this again. It's just showing. Okay, there it is.
There we go.
We're good now.
Okay, look, we've done this to death. It's like the beating in the dead horse. This comes from secular source, Serious Exploration Geochemistry. As you can see, it's very recent, 2018. This is what they have to say. The value of basin models used in petroleum exploration depends critically on our assumptions about the geologic process and physical phenomena represented in these models. Some assumptions are explicit, others are implicit, but all are imperfect, and some may simply be wrong. Now, I'm gonna show some empirical operational science here. I spoke to John McKay just yesterday, I think it was, about some of the work that he's currently doing. This is the previous flume experiment that he undertook. He's now on flume 11, I think, experiment number 11. But what you can see there is clearly John's recreated the anticlines and synclines, and he's clearly stated that they're not due to subsidence or uplift. You can see what he's done there is all he did was vary the velocity of the water, and he created all these different shapes. Who can see these shapes clearly on the screen and compare them to some real geological features? There's another one. Does that look like a basin there? Okay.
It does. Yes.
And there's some geological features. There's some more. The layering. John even has shown that the actual layers grow from left to right depending on the flow of the water, of course. And they sideways. They grow vertically. So the lowest layer is not necessarily the youngest. And that can clearly be shown through the operational science. What he's saying, there's that picture again. Some more secular information. And look at this. Form parallel to the current. Okay, there you go. Those layers, those bent layers that you see there, compared to the geological cross-sectional layer, they were created in 20 minutes, not millions of years. You don't need millions of years to do it. We have done the actual science on this. You can see clearly that these kind of features don't need long periods of time to form with heat and uplift, as the secular science will have you believe. They can't demonstrate that. We can demonstrate that they don't take millions of years. There's another photo. Okay, some more. Secular. I'm not sure. I think I put that in there because of the differences in ages between the Eukaryote plateau basalt lavas and the Cardenas, which sort of puts another nail in the coffin regarding that issue about dating methods corroborating each other. So there's that Tepeet sandstone that I mentioned can be traced all the way through various continents, right through the Middle East and so forth. Now, cool Jesus, are you listening? This is the Tepeet sandstone bent layer. You can see that's almost a 90-degree bend. Now, the secular science explanation to that is it occurred deep down in the earth under great pressure and heat. That's how they explain the fact that there's very little fractures in the material. Well, Dr. Snelling went through hell to actually get samples from the Grand Canyon. They actually tried to stop him from doing that, and he actually took them to court. And based on freedom of religion, he was able to go there and collect the samples that he needed to do his study. And this is what I'll show you what the study actually found. There's some photos there of bent rock layers. You can see the intricacies of those layers. And this is what's happened. He actually did microscope studies of the actual crystals, and he found no fractures in the crystals at all. And it showed sedimentation that could only occur while the actual sandstone was wet, still wet. So this is a science paper that he will come out with. So you can read it and try and reproduce it if you like. But as I said, it's operational science. We're doing the real science.
Yes.
While the secular people are stuck into this rut about billions of years and trying to explain their features based around assumptions and their fairy tale of
I'll inject here how important what George says is true. If you go back to previous feeds that we have done, George and I, we have shown that from the standpoint of rock mechanics, you simply cannot get a rigid object like my cell phone under the kind of pressure that the secular science are trying to explain away the anticlines and synclines in the Tepeets. You can't get something like this to fold without fracturing. George has seen it from the standpoint of civil engineering. I've seen it from the standpoint of rock mechanics, and it simply cannot be done.
Donnie, can you put that comment back up? No, he hasn't. He's only published an introductory. The detailed stuff is to come. So sorry, cool Jesus, you're wrong. There's still more to come. Just keep an eye.
Now let's go back to Erika's critique. I'll show one photograph, and then Donnie, if you will read the first section of what that geologist viewed as a critique, George and I will comment about it. I do want to show you this neat photograph. This is a photograph that I got at a Texas oil museum that shows a petroleum drilling operation years ago. You can see the pipe there and all the guys working. Did these men find this Texas crude oil by the systematic application of evolutionary theory by looking at different elemental ratios? They did not. They did not at all. But let's go to the formal critique. Go ahead and read the section to me, Donnie, and I will respond.
All right, here we go. Let's have some fun. I also want to point out that anybody who's just joining us, because I noticed we got 60 people in the chat, the first hour and a half roughly was spent on the ordering of the fossil records. So if you've not yet seen that portion, when this is over, definitely check that out. We were thorough. And George, Professor McQueen, fantastic job. This show will be going on the website ASAP. So here we go. Let's read a little bit more of this critique. It's been fun to address, and I think Professor McQueen can agree it's been quite easy to refute as well. So here we go from Mr. Wilford. Regarding the quote from Yun A.L., 2010, page 759, which states that understanding the timing of petroleum emplacement estimated using BPSM is crucial for predicting new prospecting regions, McQueen asserts. So he's commenting on something you said, McQueen.
Yes.
McQueen asserts the authors have it exactly backwards, and that such predictions are made by looking at geophysical maps for new prospecting regions. This is backed up with by his personal anecdote. Of course, geophysical data is certainly a part of it, and nobody denies that. However, Yun is backed up by L. Hajeri A.L., 2009, who gives examples of BPSM being used to predict new prospecting regions with other methods had deemed unviable. They are also backed up by Simons in 2021, apparently, who notes that solely geophysical exploration has many issues and that especially in frontier basins, play-based exploration prior to prospect definition is superior than using solely geophysical exploration to locate new prospecting areas, as it guides the search for potential prospects to the lowest risk
That's
areas
enough.
of the
That's
basin
enough.
as a whole. There you go.
I've heard enough to be able to critique that viewpoint. Let's go back to it. Give me my screen. Let me teach using this here. There's a tree there above Texas, showing that we're looking at a cross section. There is a blue anticline filled in with some crude oil and natural gas. How do I counter the argument that it's basin analysis that we find this? Well, I have spent some of the last 30 days talking with people here in Louisiana who have worked in the petroleum industry for some of them as much as 30 years. And I've also called and spoken to very senior executives in some of the major oil companies. I don't have permission to give their names and the name of the oil company. It's not Shell Oil, but I'll use that as an example. How do the major oil companies use a teamwork approach like we use here at Standing for Truth to find a basin to look in? They have a group of people that do what has been described as basin analysis. But I've asked around and I said, well, what is it actually like? And they said, well, McQueen, you have to understand, there'll be 20 of us in a big conference room, and we'll each have 5 minutes to present a viewpoint to senior management. Now, to the right and the left of senior management, as you might imagine, are accountants, because Shell Oil is not going to spend $10 million on a lease in Texas and another $20 million drilling a well if there's not some way of knowing that you're going to find some crude oil there. Let me make clear again some of the vocabulary. I have spoken to you in the past about looking for bright lines or bright lighting. in seismic information. And I'll use this pink red color here to indicate what on a seismic line is called a bright line. Well, those bright lines focus on natural gas. In talking around since our last discussion, I've noticed that the actual people that do this work for big groups like Shell Oil will use the word, "Oh, that's fizzy water." And I said, what do you mean? Water like Alka-Seltzer's in it? He said, well, sometimes you get some natural gas that's associated with underground water, and it produces kind of like a fizzy structure that shows up as a bright line. So we spend $5 million to drill down and find it, just to find that we found essentially a pool of Alka-Seltzer. Not really. It's natural gas and water, but it's a false positive in this work. So how does it work from a practical standpoint? They have a group of geologists in there that have studied where in this part of Texas crude oil has been found in the past. They give their report. There are a group of people, no question about it, that do the basin analysis as has been described by Erika and her team earlier, that put their 2 cents worth in. But you have to understand that of these 20 people in the room, the basin analysis folks, the folks that are dealing with ratios of certain elements and what they might indicate about whether the crude oil has matured to a certain point or the basin is worth looking at, they're only 1/20th of the group that's actually doing the talking. There's a geophysical component. There is a petroleum engineering component to all of this. But I would argue, from my experience, having taught petroleum geologists, having talked over the last 30 days with these people, that the trump card, and it's not a reference to American politics, I'm talking about the card game where you have a trump card. The trump card in a lot of these arguments is geophysics. If you can't show a geophysical signature for an anticlinal trap, you're dead in the water. Donnie, George, what do you think of that little detail?
I think it's great. I think it's great, brother. George?
Yes, I agree. What's the next bit of debunking?
Yeah,
okay,
let's go read another paragraph to us.
Okay, so he's got a bunch of quotes here. He's got his summary here, but I am curious. I think this will be a good something to respond to Professor McQueen on the trap content, and I'll read through here. So, regarding the statements from L. Hajeri AL and Peters AL, which emphasize the importance of using BPSM to predict trap content, McQueen once more asserts, and I'll just read this paragraph, Professor McQueen, you can give your comments. McQueen once more asserts these authors have it totally wrong. Instead, McQueen argues trap content is predicted using something known as bright spotting. This is a real thing, though he's using the vague terminology for it. Technically, there are many different types of seismic anomalies which may indicate hydrocarbons, not just bright spots. In brackets, he puts dim spots, flat spots, etc. The term for this whole category is direct hydrocarbon indicators, or DHIs. Semantic quibble aside, he claims this is the holy grail of petroleum geology, as it allows direct determination of trap content prior to drilling. This is primarily based in prospect-based exploration rather than play-based exploration. Actually, I think for context, I should read just a little bit more of this next paragraph.
Okay, very well.
Yet if we look at the literature itself, we don't see such a neat picture, Mr. Wilford says. For instance, he's got a paper here. Note that not all DHIs represent hydrocarbon accumulations, and not all hydrocarbon accumulations are associated with DHIs. Schumacher,
Okay,
likewise. Yeah, we can stop there. We can
Yeah,
stop
let
there.
me comment. Okay, here is his DHI, which can be translated for those students in the class here. What we're talking about is the direct determination of the presence of oil at depth. And I would argue that my analogy to this being the holy grail of petroleum engineering is absolutely correct. Because if you can go to an absolutely virgin field that you might be able to find through the application of catastrophic sedimentology and sequence stratigraphy, I've done it myself, working in private with some geophysicists years ago in offshore Nigeria. I found some areas there that were very good prospects looking at the seismic signature. But if there were a way to make DHI, or what I call the direct determination of hydrocarbons at depth, if you could do that and combine it with catastrophic flood geology, you would have a money-making proposition. Now, let me take this moment to talk about this whole nasty subject of money in US dollars, money in euros, or as George and I are paid once a year, the 100 Chinese yen, that's $16 a year. That's a lot of money. And so we're talking about money here. And how does that tie into the arguments that Erika and others have made? The challenge of her bevy of geologists that flutter around her is, okay, McQueen, if catastrophic flood stratigraphy is so good at finding crude oil, how come you guys haven't formed your own company and finding this all over the world? Well, the answer to that, sadly, revolves around money.
Money, yeah.
It takes not just $1 million, but hundreds of millions of dollars spread over a 20 or 30-year period to be able to find crude oil. Now, furthermore, the critics of what I have to say and the critics of Andrew Snelling and others have said, well, you creationists are truly insane, because how come these geologists, and I'll use a guy who's 30 years old, got his degree, let's say in 1990, and he's been working for 30 years for Shell Oil in New Orleans, for example. Why would he not, if he were a Christian creationist, make it known to senior management, oh, it turns out that we really don't need paleontology. We really don't need basin analysis. All we need is geophysics and a little bit of flood geology. Would that individual keep his job? The answer is no. The senior management of the oil companies are all old, white, both men and women, that got their degrees from Michigan and Penn State and so forth between 1975 and let's say 1990. And they're now the senior managers controlling all this. They have bought into the evolutionary they bought into the evolutionary terminology. They're not going to throw off the vocabulary of Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. They're going to use that, and they're going to fire or demote people. Why are these people silent? Well, their children need scholarships to the local university. Their children need a car to drive to go to the university. And so they know enough to know that if they were open, that there is, and Donnie and you and George can comment about this, is there not open discrimination in the scientific community toward anybody that takes a young earth point of view? Is that true, gentlemen?
Well, yes, that was demonstrated by the fact AIG through Dr. Snelling when they tried to get a permit to do that study at the Grand Canyon. But just something closer to home, Donnie, you'll remember Steph Harina. He had a paper which was accepted by one of the Dutch journals, and I think they published it, but once they caught wind that he was a young Earth creationist, they quickly removed that paper without an explanation. So if you think it's a conspiracy, Big Bad Mama, I think you need to really have a look in the mirror.
Yeah, this is not conspiratorial. This is the pecking order. Let me give yet another example. When I was a professor at Virginia State University, I was invited by then Attorney General Bill Clinton's staff to be part of the 1981-1982 Arkansas Creation Evolution trial. Now, this is not the quite famous trial that occurred in Louisiana that many people know went to the Supreme Court. This is the one before it in 81-82. I agreed to present some work from my master's thesis work at Michigan that indicated that geologic processes could occur quickly and catastrophically. I was deposed by the ACLU on the same day, I might add, that my old boss Bob Gentry was in Atlanta, Georgia. The Deputy Assistant Attorney General, state of Arkansas, that Bill Clinton assigned to help me was so sick he fell asleep in the interrogation room. So there I am sitting with a bunch of high-paid ACLU attorneys. They have hired a bunch of geologists from the local university. And my advocate is asleep on the table. And so what I found out that day is that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is un-American, has no interest in civil behavior, and is certainly not interested in liberty. To show you the cruelty that I have been shown in this case, they, through their research, became aware that my mother was dying of cancer in Tennessee, and that I intended to go visit her right after the deposition. And so in order to throw me off my game during their interrogation, they made fun of my mother's death. Would you consider that, Donnie, even-handed, my friend?
Yeah, that's interesting, Professor McQueen. Yeah.
Yeah. So the stakes are quite high, as George has pointed out.
Right.
And there are some real enemies of the truth of the gospel. I'm trying to think of any additional information that I could share.
Well, let me mention this, Professor McQueen.
Yeah, please.
In order to leave no stone unturned, I think you've done a great job, and it's pretty clear that you know there's not much here in terms of response, but there's one section here. I'll share screen. One section we'll kind of end it with.
Okay,
Professor McQueen, and then I know you had something that you wanted to share as well.
Yes.
And lots of great feedback and compliments in the chat. So to leave no stone unturned, I wanted to point out this last part in his response, and then we'll call it on this one. Where was it? I'm curious as to, okay, right here. So we'll address, I'm curious as to your thoughts here. I think this is important, and then we'll end it on Mr. Wolford. So he says, on the issue of personal experience, I've also spoken with a retired petroleum geologist about this personally on notpeacefulscience.org with Joshua Stramidas is his name. He's the one that runs the blog. So he says, here's what he told me about his experience with basin modeling and its importance. Okay, so he's quoting now the retired petroleum geologist. You are quite correct about the importance of basin modeling and hydrocarbon exploration. Exploration wells are costly things, usually in the order of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars apiece. Success is far from guaranteed, with the global wildcat success ratio hovering around the 50%. And if a well fails to find commercial quantities of hydrocarbons, the money is completely gone without any returns. It is not surprising then that management and ultimately shareholders expect the companies to throw the scientific book at their prospects. I am talking about true wildcats here, wells drilled to test a new play. Obviously, there are less risky exploration wells, the kind that further explores a basin and a play that has already been proven to be productive. But the game changers, the play openers, will need to be supported by as much science as we can muster. And the last quote from him is, basin modeling has been a major focus of study and software development for decades now. I have worked in 2 major oil and gas companies, and both of them required a basin model to be completed and presented before a play opener well proposal would pass technical sign-off, let alone full approval. No basin model, no well, as simple as that.
Okay, I see how to respond here. Let's notice what the vocabulary is. He's saying you have to have a basin model. Wildcat wells can cost $100 million. Only 1 in 2 of them end up producing petroleum. So when you're going to do a new well in a brand new area, the senior management is not going to throw $100 million away. Now, part of what I'm beginning to see as a problem in Erika and her team of geologists is, I'm not saying that crude oil doesn't mature in a basin and then migrate to a reservoir which can be found and then drilled. I'm just saying that the catastrophic sequence stratigraphy model for understanding a basin is a better way to understand a basin, not by what we've discussed previously, where a basin is defined by some ratio between a couple of elements on the periodic table. If you're talking about a true wildcat in a new area, then you're not going to have the data. You will have no idea what the conodont color index is, or that I talked about with Harris and Epstein last time. You're going to have no idea what the ratio of certain elements are, even something as simple as oxygen-oxygen isotope ratios. You have none of that. How are new basins found? They're found by the systematic application of geophysical information. And the geophysical information, in my experience, offshore Nigeria, and I'm talking about southwest of the African coast, can be best explained by catastrophic flood geology. Let me tell you my favorite anecdote from my teaching experience at Virginia State University and my study of petroleum geology. Now, part of my anecdote comes under the category of me as being the great-great-grandson of people from the Scottish Highlands coming to America, in part because of some very onerous things that the British government and the Crown did to them. So my great-great-grandfather came to North Carolina, and that's where I hail from. And so I've got a little bit of a rub, genetically, you might say, between the Scots and the Brits. And so I love this story. So in the time immediately after World War II, and also prior to that, the Brits were going all over Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, looking for oil. And so they would ask the locals there, have you seen any oil seeps? Because if you go back to 1859 and the first oil wells in Pennsylvania that Drake did and so forth, they were put in places where the American Indians told them that there were seeps of tar and so forth. And so I can just imagine in my Scottish mind's eye these Brits getting in their Jeep, getting in their Land Rover, and they follow the map that the people give to them. They follow the map, and their Jeep actually drives into a tar pit, and they can't escape. And so these two British geologists are sitting there saying, well, it's almost tea time. This is probably a good place to drill. Well, what did they find when they drilled there? There are some very famous fields in this part of the Middle East called the Gawar field and other things. And George, as an engineer, you'll appreciate this statistic. When the Brits actually drilled down into these, they found that the porosity and the permeability from an petroleum engineering standpoint, it was if they were pumping the crude oil out of an underground storage tank. Now, this leads to the false idea that there are rivers of oil, but it turns out that if Moses had turned right instead of left, that could have been his oil down there in that part of the Persian Gulf. But all joking to one side, some of the major oil fields, now keep in mind that 10% of all the petroleum on Earth is within, let's say, 1,000-mile radius around Jerusalem, and especially down in Saudi. So we're talking about huge oil fields that were found not by some systematic application of basin analysis, but because the Brits drove their Jeep in it and got stuck. I think that's a good story.
That's awesome, Professor McQueen. I got to say, this has been a fantastic response, Brother McQueen. Great job. George, I know you had a few things you wanted to say there.
Oh, I was going to say, Jed Clampett just fired his rifle, missed the rabbit, and he was a millionaire.
Yeah, millionaire. You know, I'm already 2 hours past my bedtime, so we can keep going if you want to for a while longer. I may have to get some more coffee, but other than that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just hit the 2 hour mark, and that pretty well concluded. I think we hit all the key points from Mr. Wilford and good old Gutsick Gibbon there. So I'm not sure if you brothers had any concluding statements you wanted to make or take one last question. It's up to you guys. It's up to you guys.
I'd like to say I hope the people in the chat take notice of that operational science that creationists are doing. I mean, if we had the available funds that the secular community have, I'm sure we could find a lot of solutions to the so-called "what about this, what about that" that they keep bringing up.
Exactly.
But we'll get there, as they say, in the long climb up the mountain of knowledge. When they finally get there, they'll find the creation that's standing there, telling them, "What took you so long?"
Well, it's a very good point. Why don't you get two more questions from the audience chat? While I'll go get some coffee, let George answer the first one, and then I'll come back and answer the second one. Okay? George.
I mean, we could
go. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's okay. I was going to say, since we hit the 2 hour mark, I mean, we could call it. We did an hour and a half of the ordering of the fossils. Brother McQueen, you did a fantastic response there on the fossil fuel industry. We could just get concluding statements from you guys and call it a night. I mean, George, I know you're tired, but it's up to you guys.
You're the boss in this. Now, I've begun to dip my toes into YouTube. Do I understand that some of your colleagues have what they call some sort of after show, or I forget what the fellow calls it.
I'm drained, Donnie. I woke up at 4 a.m. today, and so I'm just totally spent.
Yeah, I'm past my bedtime. Let me make a concluding comment, and then we can call it. Okay.
Perfect.
Remember that what George and I have emphasized over the last year is that everything needs to cycle back to the Lord Jesus. Our concern as men that have studied this issue and also are Christians is that in the months ahead, you actually change your mind, that you begin to think in terms of the Lord Jesus being the creator. You begin to realize that sin and sinfulness is mankind's problem. Our problem is not superficially a worldwide coronavirus. Our problem is not superficially whatever activity Russia might have in Ukraine or whatever might go on in the jungles of South America. That's not our focus. All those negative things, one way or the other, are the result of the fall of mankind covered in Genesis 3, 4, 5, in that section. And so the good creator is the offended creator. And so we need to pause and say, if the great flood that produces all this is a clear example of judgment, how am I going to be judged? And so then we go through the rest of the progression, coming up to Easter, the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and then on into the future, where we have the hope of heaven. So he's the creator, the savior, and the coming king. Think of that as a summary of what we've done tonight. Back to you, Donnie.
Amen. Well said. As always, great final words, very important final words as well, Professor McQueen. George, concluding statement, final words from you. Again, both of you, fantastic show. This was really, really good. So go ahead, George.
Yeah, well, I'll do something similar. I'll just quote the Bible. Just remember, Jesus said, first, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Secondly, he said, love your neighbor as yourself.
Amen.
There is no commandment greater than these. So I hope the atheists, skeptics in the chat, just take that on board, that we're not here to mock you and ridicule you. We're just trying to spread the truth. And hopefully you can recognize that and say blessings. And as Jesus commanded us, we love you.
Amen. And with that, Donnie, I'm going to move my cursor down and leave the studio.
Before you do, Professor McQueen, let me just give you a couple shout outs. Professor David McQueen, it's a blessing. You are a great debater. I love hosting and moderating your debates. Professor McQueen versus Taylor. Snake was right. The Great Age of the Earth debate. That is coming up first thing next month. Then in April, this is going to be a great technical discussion between Professor McQueen and, if I could find the image here, Professor McQueen and Jason Torn, the Genesis flood debate. So stay tuned for those guys.
I'll try to illustrate that Snake was wrong. Snake is not wrong. Good night, you guys.
Good night, brothers.
Good night, David. Say hello to Shirley.